the right button now. Call this meeting to order. There's a couple of things I need to read into the record, but before so, I'm going to introduce the dais. There was a request from some of you out there to know who is sitting up here. All the way to the end is Kim Wilkins. She is the clerk of the court. Sarah Commander, Commissioner, District 3, 4. You think I know that by now. Then Commissioner Nipper, District 3. It's Commissioner Jones, District 2. And Commissioner Henderson, District 5. And I'm Bill Chapman, District 1, Chairman. Got Larry Jones, County Administrator. We got Cindy Noyes, our County Attorney, and of course the court reporter is at the end. As we move through this process, there will be a time for public comment. We ask everybody as you come forward, if you want to make a comment, to identify yourself so our record is clean and accurate, loud enough for our clerk and also the court reporter to pick up on it. If you have any electronic devices, please silence them at this time. And there's a couple things I need to read into the record before we get started. I'll also be able to introduce Mr. David Theriak, who will be our presenter from behalf of the county. We will begin the County Commissioner's public hearing on whether to adopt a formal notice of intent to affirm the existence of recreational customary use on certain properties in Walton County, Florida. The public hearing will proceed as follows. First, there will be a presentation by the county attorney and the county special land use attorney. This will be followed by public comments limited to 3 minutes at this time, followed by comments by attorneys representing clients, which will be limited to 10 minutes each. At the conclusion of all the comments, the county commission will vote on whether to adopt a formal notice of intent to affirm the existence of recreational customary use on certain properties in Walton County. Sydney, please proceed with your presentation by the county attorney and the county special land use council.
At this time, I'll turn it over to Dave Theriak, who will make the presentation on behalf of the county.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, members of the audience. Let's do it this way. It might be easier if I hold it closer. Does this work? All right. I'm rarely told that people can't hear me, so that works out good. I'm going to start the presentation this morning with an overview of what is customary use, what is the law on customary use, what the county's actions were regarding its efforts to protect the public's right to use the dry sand in Walton County, and then what the Florida legislature did in reaction to the county's efforts, and then explain what we're going to do today. And they told me it would work when I clicked it. There we go. This slide is just intended to explain what part of the beach is at issue. You see a delineation called wet beach. Wet beach is owned by the public. The water that covers sand is owned by the public. And the issue that customary use focuses in, you see a line that says mean high tide line. It's also sometimes called the mean high water line. You go landward to vegetation, or sometimes to a seawall. It's the land that's landward of that mean high water line up to the vegetation. That land is frequently privately owned. Customary use addresses whether the public can use dry sand that is privately owned. The doctrine of custom originated in the U.S. in Oregon, a case called Thornton v. Hay. In that case, the court established customary rights over the dry sand area of all of Oregon's Pacific coastline. And they utilized a doctrine from England where the public could acquire rights to use land. Individual people did not obtain that right, but groups of people, the general public as a whole, would obtain the right based upon custom to use certain places. And in the Oregon case, the Supreme Court established 7 components to establishing custom. In Florida, the first case that dealt with customary use is a case called City of Daytona Beach versus Tonorama. And there are 2 quotes from the Tonorama case that I want to share with you today, because it's very telling of how beachfront property is different than any other property in the state of Florida. This is just a good quote out of Tonorama. No part of Florida is more exclusively tourist, nor more properly utilized by other people than other regions. And the right of the public of access to, enjoyment of, Florida's oceans and beaches has long been recognized by this court. This is the Florida Supreme Court in 1974. All right, what's that? All right, sorry about that, folks. Another quote from Tonorama: "The beaches of Florida are of such a character as to use and potential development as to require separate consideration from other lands with respect to the elements and consequences of title. The sandy portion of the beaches are of no use for farming, grazing, timber production, or residency for the traditional uses of land, but has served as a thoroughfare and a haven for fishermen and bathers, as well as a place of recreation for the public. The interests and rights of the public, the full use of the beaches, should be protected." Again, this is the Florida Supreme Court. And here's your test that the Florida Supreme Court set forth for the customary use. If the recreational use of the sandy area adjacent to mean high tide has been ancient, reasonable, without interruption, and free from dispute, such use as a matter of custom should not be interfered with by the owner. However, the owner may make any use of his property which is consistent with such public use, not calculated to interfere with the exercise of the right of the public to enjoy the dry sand area as a recreational adjunct of wet sand or shore area. This right of customary use of the dry sand area and beaches by the public does not create any interest in the land itself. The rights of the owner of the dry The rights of the owner of the dry sand area may be compared to the rights of the part owner of a landlocked and non-navigable lake.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Jason. Lewis, you got it figured out here?
I'm trying, sir.
Does this one work? Can you hear me? It's a Verizon commercial. Can you hear me now? All right, let's continue. The rights of the owner of the dry sand area may be compared to the rights of a part owner of a landlocked, non-navigable lake. The general public may continue to use the dry sand area for their usual recreational activities, not because the public has any interest in the land itself, but because of a right gained through custom to use this particular area of the beach as they have without dispute and without interruption for many years. So in sum, the Florida Supreme Court found that the public had a right of customary use of the dry sand area of a specific tract of the land. They established the test that has to be ancient, reasonable, without interruption, free from dispute. It does not create an interest in the land itself. It's not an easement. It's known as the customary use of
The fifth ECA in 2007 provided some guidance on how to analyze whether customary use exists on the beach. And this dealt with a case again in Volusia County, and the court held to establish a customary right. We do not suggest that the county must prove that cars, horses, or other modes of transportation have customarily traversed and parked on appellant's specific parcels of property. Rather, we read Tonorama to require proof that the general area of the beach where appellant's property is located has customarily been put to such use, and that the extent of such customary use of private property is consistent with the public's claim of right. So when showing customary use, the historic use does not need to be on a specific parcel at issue. Rather, the use must be within the general area of the beach where the parcel is located. Some folks have argued that in order to prove customary use, that you have to prove customary use lot by lot by lot. And we respectfully submit that the Volusia County case establishes that it's the area in which the lot is located. In fact, it's almost illogical to say lot by lot. We're going back in time where lots did not exist. Other territories recognize the doctrine of custom: Hawaii, Texas, Idaho, Rhode Island, and Virgin Islands. All right, what did the county do? The county adopted an ordinance in 2016 that established the customary use ordinance in Walton County. It was supposed to become effective April 1, 2017. As part of the adoption of that ordinance, the county has created a work group to work on the customary use ordinance. And that resulted in a new ordinance. The first one never became effective. The new ordinance, 2017-10. And it protects the public's right to use the dry sand. It establishes certain uses that are deemed to be recreational uses that are appropriate on the dry sand. And that became effective on April 1st, 2017. As a result of that ordinance, the county was sued. We actually were sued 7 times. And I'm going to address one. The federal court in the Alford lawsuit, in that case, the property owners were contending that the county did not have what's known as the home rule power to adopt a customary use ordinance, that only a court could establish customary use. And the federal court, the district court, held and concluded that the county, in fact, had that home rule authority and upheld our ordinance. As a result of that decision, several folks lobbied the Florida legislature, and the Florida legislature adopted a new law. And let me skim there, so you can see it. It's section 163035, which essentially invalidated Walton County's customary use ordinance. It grandfathered 2 counties that had ordinances that were in place prior to Walton County, but they invalidated Walton County's, and they established a new process that local governments that want to protect customary use on the dry sand have to jump through. And that's why we're here today. We're following the new statutory process that the Florida legislature adopted when they invalidated the county's ordinance. And flip through one more. Here's your notice of public hearing to adopt a formal notice of intent to affirm the existence of recreational customary use on private property. At the end of today's hearing, or actually at the end of the testimony, when the hearing goes back to the board will vote on whether to adopt the formal notice. In that formal notice, there is an Exhibit A. The statute requires the county to identify the parcels on which customary use is being determined. And we have created a Excel spreadsheet by parcel number with names. That Exhibit A is 37 pages long. We have 1,195 parcels. that will be at issue in the formal notice. And if the commission votes to approve the formal notice, then the customary use determination will be on the parcels identified as Exhibit A. The Florida legislature also created an obligation of the county to identify sources of evidence that the county intends to rely upon when we go to circuit court. The next step after today, if the board votes to approve a formal notice, is that the county must file a lawsuit in circuit court. And the county will file a declaratory judgment action asking the circuit court to determine whether or not the evidence supports the customary use determinations on the parcels that are listed on Exhibit A. And this is the first time this statute has ever been applied, because it's a brand new statute. So what we've done for today is I have an index that is 60 pages long of all the documents that are related to the analysis of customary use on the beaches of Walton County. Behind the clerk, there are 18 volumes, which was the first cut, of documentary evidence, aerial photographs, plats, deeds, maps, pictures, newspaper articles, literally 18 volumes of evidence. Also in, this is Exhibit B, at the end of on page 60, we also list other sources of evidence, which will include the expert witness testimony of Dr. James Miller, the testimony of residents of Walton County, the testimony of visitors of Walton County, affidavits of residents of Walton County, affidavits of visitors of Walton County, pictures provided by residents of Walton County, pictures provided by visitors of Walton County, minutes of meetings held by the Walton County Board of County Commissioners, ordinances adopted by the Walton County Board of County Commissioners, emails sent to beach issues at co.walton.fl.us, development records in the custody of the Walton County Planning Department, plats, deeds, easements, agreements, orders, and other documents filed in the official records of Walton County, Florida, and a transcript of the Walton County Board of County Commissioner meeting held on September 8th, 2018. Many of you may have been here on September 8th. We had at least 4 hours of testimony from the general public and property owners, and our court reporter transcribed the testimony. We had a transcript of everything that was said during the September 8th hearing. We also have provided to the clerk over 9,000 affidavits by visitors and residents of folks in Walton County. And those are volumes 1 through 27 that are next to the clerk of court. We then received another batch of affidavits, which we were not able to index. I do have an index, a master index as well, of the 9,000 affidavits plus that we received. And each of the commissioners has a copy of that master index. Each of the commissioners has a copy of the sources of evidence, and each commissioner also has Exhibit A, which is each of the parcels that are at issue. The second batch of affidavits that we received, I believe, on Thursday, we just simply ran out of time to index those. They are, I believe, base stamped. They're in volumes 1 through 4, which the clerk asked. And then we also have 5 volumes of emails with pictures from residents and visitors that folks have sent into the county to establish customary use on the beach. As I indicated, we also have the transcript. We have provided all of this information to the board, and it's available to members of the public. It's a public records request. You can put it on a flash drive and provide that to you at your request. And again, the reason we went to this level of detail is this is the first time a county or a local government has gone to circuit court. And I wanted to avoid the argument that somebody would say, you didn't present a piece of paper, you only referred to it. I think that's over-technical, but in abundance of caution, we've killed a lot of trees. So you have a lot of documents up there. And then, in conclusion, before I turn it over to Dr. Miller, I want to stress the county's position. I haven't had an opportunity to speak to many of the members in the audience, and I think sometimes there's a little bit of misinformation about what is customary use and whether or not somebody's property has been taken by a customary use determination. It's the county's position, and we've done this in the lawsuits that we've defended, and the Florida Supreme Court has made it clear, beachfront property is different. It's different from my property in the subdivision of Leon County, it's different in the lot in the forest. The Florida Supreme Court has clearly said that beachfront property is different than other property. And it's our contention that the evidence establishes that customary use on the beaches has occurred for generations, and that the folks that have moved to Walton County that have had concerns about people using the dry sand, that when they bought their property, they lacked the right to tell somebody to get off the dry sand. That's typically called the right to exclude. It's in your bundle of rights when you buy property. But when you purchase your property, if the county is correct, and we believe we are, that when you purchase your property, you did not have that screen. You did not have the right to say, get off the dry sand. Because there was a co-equal right of the public and the property owner to use the dry sand. So if you didn't have the right, and all we're doing here today is recognizing something that we believe the evidence supports has existed for generations, then the property owner who's being told that the public has a right to use the dry sand is not losing anything. He was already burdened by that right when they bought his or her property. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jim Miller.
Can you hear me? Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, members of the audience. Can you hear me? Louder? Louder? Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, members of the audience, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jim Miller. I'm an archaeologist and a historian and a planner, and I've been engaged by Mr. Theriak's firm to prepare a history of the Walton County beachfront in relation to the 4 elements of customary use. My presentation is a summary of the findings, but it will be kind of lengthy. I want to present a lot of evidence to you today to demonstrate that there has been an extensive, a pervasive, and very long-lasting use of the beach by the public in Walton County. Just to introduce myself briefly, you can tell by my white hair, I've been researching archaeology and history of Florida for a long time, about 50 years now. I have a bachelor's in anthropology with a specialty in archaeology from FSU. I have a master's from Duke University in anthropology, a master's in city and regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in that same subject area from the University of Pennsylvania in 1991. I wrote my dissertation on an environmental history of Northeast Florida. Environmental history is the approach that I bring to this study. It is a way of looking at the land and the people and the water all as a single interacting unit. I've been a registered professional archaeologist for 40 years. I was the state archaeologist of Florida and the chief of archaeological research for 20 years. And since that time, I've been a consultant with a specialty in historic preservation, environmental history, GIS applications. I've been an expert witness. I study architectural history, historic cemetery preservation, legislation and regulations, and public policy. More than 100 presentations and publications, including 2 books. The study area that we have selected is the entire beach of Walton County, and it's bounded by Okaloosa County on the west, it's bounded by Bay County on the east, the south side, of course, is the beach, and the north side, for present purposes, is Choctawhatchee Bay, as well as an intracoastal waterway. The study is divided into sections, which I call detail sheets, and each of the types of information that I will present to you is managed and mapped, organized by GIS, Geographic Information System. And the study area shows 6 sheets running from west to east, sheet 1 through sheet 6. All of the information that I will present today is organized in exactly the same way. So if you find a location you're paying attention to in sheet 2, when we look at patent records, it will be on sheet 2. When we look at archaeological sites, it will be on sheet 2, and so on. There's approximately 26 linear miles of beachfront in Walton County. You can see here that those 6 sheets divide from one county line to the other. They are approximately 4 miles wide, running due east-west rather than diagonally. And each one of them contains a little bit of public land. I've depicted that in light green. There are several parcels, principal parcels, such as Topsail Hill, Drayton Beach State Park, and Deer Lake State Park that make up the principal public land in Florida. Those are areas which have not been emphasized and which appear differently in the study because there is not an issue of customary use of that publicly owned land or an opportunity for a dispute by a private owner. You'll also see that as we go through the information about settlement of the land, those areas remain relatively unsettled because they were in such large ownership compared to the rest of the county. The elements of customary use, Mr. Theriak has already discussed in great detail, and I simply list them here to indicate that these are the 4 things that I focused on in my research. There are a lot of things that I did not spend time on that might be part of a more general history of Walton County, but I mined the records and the historical sources to find information that would be relevant to the elements of customary use. So the goals of the study are summarized in the last line: to collect, organize, and interpret the evidence for customary use. And there are several approaches, several pieces of that need to be controlled in order to get to the final interpretation. One is the timing and duration of beach use. So when did beach use begin? How long did it last? The second is the location and distribution of beach use. Where was it and when? There are various types of beach use that need to be documented. I took care to identify the individuals and families and social networks important in the development and use of the beach. Some people have been very prominent in the history of Walton County in using the beach and developing the beach and providing access to the beach. I wanted to identify the beach communities and understand the traditions and customs related to the beach. Now, where all this is going is that human behavior and use of the beach is not random. It doesn't occur in random locations. It doesn't occur at random times. It's patterned. And the more we know about beach use in certain areas, the more likely we can interpret beach use in other areas because because those patterns are very long-lasting and pervasive and identifiable. The methods I followed were to collect and organize information in computer databases, and those were of two kinds. First of all, they're textual or numeric databases, such as a spreadsheet or a translational database of information about beach use. More importantly, I mapped this information that was spatial, that is, that had a location in time and that had an existence in the chronology in the GIS. I reviewed narratives, articles, studies, and public records. I participated in interviews of people who have long been in the community. I reviewed, especially important, relevant photographs, maps, and videos. And I constructed a chronological narrative of beach use in Walton County from the earliest human occupation to the present. Finally, I analyzed and interpreted those findings in relation to customary use. My sources of evidence were highly varied. First of all, archaeological site information from the Florida Master Site File is significant for understanding what happened on the beach before the arrival of Europeans around AD 1500 or later. Occupation of the beach by native people began around 5,000 years ago and extended actually up to the current day, as you'll hear now from a subsequent speaker. Much of that information comes from the Florida Master Site File. I used U.S. government public land surveys and patent deeds to understand and to map, delineate the conveyances of public land into first private ownership, and also to understand the landscape, the geography of the beach area beginning in 1845. I used Walton County subdivision plats from public records for recorded subdivisions, as well as notes about unrecorded subdivisions beginning in 1890, officially 1893, through the end of the 1970s. I used published historic maps, I used newspaper articles, and I relied very heavily on aerial photography. I used, in addition, historic photography and video and interviews. Let me pause here for a second and call your attention to sheets of aerial photography which are hanging on the wall in the back of the auditorium outside in the hallway, and those duplicate the aerial photos that we will see in the presentation, but they're at a much larger scale, and excuse me, you can see the buildings and the roads and other cultural features on them. The archaeological site information represents a period of human occupation and use of the beach that is not represented in written records or in public records. Archaeology is a study of people based on their remains, based on traces of their activities in the landscape, and that information is maintained by the state in the Florida Master Site File. Human occupation of the beach as we know it now in Walton County began about 5,000 years ago. We'll get into that a little bit more. When the sea level was lower, there was also use of the beach, but it's now submerged. Archaeological sites are places where people left evidence of their activities. You would be familiar with arrowheads, pieces of pottery, pieces of shell, and so on. These clues are representative patterns of human activity that are common throughout the Gulf Coast. So when we find them in one place, we can make inferences about archaeological occupation in other places. We paid attention to the location, the time periods, the types of sites and artifacts, and this information represents broad cultural patterns and traditions, and it demonstrates that the use of the dry sand areas of Walton County have been ancient. We relied heavily on U.S. government surveys, those documents by which the U.S. government conveyed land to the first private owners. They began in Walton County, and all of the early ones, stretching from Bay to Escambia, were completed in 1849. Some pieces of land were resurveyed, and that happened as late as 1949. These government surveys indicate the location, the corners, the boundaries, the acreage, and the natural features. Some of the resurveys, which are called dependent resurveys, began in 1919 and lasted through 1949. There was, in some opinion, no possibility of objection prior to private ownership. That is to say, there was no private owner who would object to a public use of a piece of beach until that land was conveyed by way of a patent deed from the U.S. government. But this is the index sheet of public land surveys that were conducted between 1849 and 1949. You can see the three large parcels of publicly owned land, state-owned land. You can see the 6 index sheets. And of course, the map stretches from county line to county line. Just to show you how these look in more detail, we'll go through a couple of the detail sheets. You can see that there are 4 sections across this map, and that's typical of all 6 maps, and that the coastline is depicted by a dark black line along the bottom. I wish I could use the pointer, but if you look in the bottom or the beach side or the waterfront side of each section, you will see that there are 4, typically, 4 rectangles. Those are called lots. Each one of those lots was a subdivision of a section that could become privately owned by way of a patent deed. In sheet 2, we can see, because of the green tint of the current state ownership, we can see the difference between the coastline in 1849, which will be the dark black line on the bottom, and the current coastline, which would be the southern boundary of the shaded area. In some places, that distance is as much as 1,000 feet. That has eroded over a century and a half or so. Sheet 3 of the Public Land Survey is interesting in showing 2 of the areas that have received dependent resurveys, and they're difficult to see from this distance, but they're divided into much smaller lots on the average of 1 acre rather than 40 acres, and they're shown as kind of more dense gray in 2 locations. This is the Grayton Beach area, Grayton Beach State Park. Further down the coast, Deer Lake, and eventually to Bay County. Now the subdivision and release
of that U.S. government land was managed by the U.S. Bureau of Land Management beginning in 1893 and lasting through 1956. It represents the conveyance to the first private owner, and the records show the chronology and the location of private ownership. This action to put the land into private ownership represents the first opportunity to settle and build. So we wouldn't expect to see settlement, permanent settlement of the beachfront prior to the time that the U.S. government conveyed a parcel of land to a private owner. In my analysis, I looked at 4,417 acres in 120 beachfront deeds. In addition to being the first ownership, it's also the first possible objection to use. These are two examples of patent deeds. They're actually fairly simple. They typically indicate the lot number as well as the township range and section. And there may be some reservations, such as the one on the right, which is 0.9 acres in total size, but which reserves a right-of-way of 33 feet on the east side for public use. And that's very typical of certain time periods of patent deeds, that a public use is reserved to the beach. Now, if you map all the patent deeds and you color code them by date, you find a couple of important things. First of all, the entire county coastline is taken up by patent deeds. Second, most of those deeds, accounting for 95% of the patented land, occurred before 1929. So 90 years ago, 95% of the beach was already in private ownership. Those are indicated in this map in red dots, and then other time periods are represented by other colors later. If we look at the acres of beachfront land patented each decade, we see that the primary conveyances happened, the largest number of conveyances happened in the 1920s. If we can look at it a different way, cumulatively, and see that by the 1920s, 95% of the land had been conveyed. By the end of the 1930s, 98% had been conveyed. This is a detail of sheet 1, patent deeds. All of these you'll see have dates in the 1920s. That's very typical of the coastline. It represents a period of Florida land boom that was very intense all around the state prior to the bust of 1928. And each of the red dots indicates the center of one of the lots that was created by the surveyor and conveyed. The acreages are listed on the map. In addition, the names of the patentee and the date of the patent are indicated at the bottom. Again, 1920s, one 1916, 1917, 1919. 1920s primarily, again, those two dependent resurveys. And you can see here more clearly the difference between the black line at the bottom and of the shoreline and the blue line slightly above it, representing the difference between the 1849 survey and the 1940 and the present coastline. Brayton Beach area. Inlet Beach area. On the very far right by Bay County line, the original survey was rather imprecise and it was necessary for a dependent resurvey to be done there, which divided the land into much smaller parcels, delineated the water bodies more accurately, and that resulted in a number of deeds in the 1950s. We used newspaper articles which ran from 1906 to 1954. They were primarily from the Defuniak Herald and the Pensacola Journal. Now, it turns out that going to the beach was a popular activity and one that was extensively documented in the newspapers. And if you assemble all of the articles, there are 63 of them, between May 1906 and July 1954, you will find 978 people named or enumerated. This slide says 943, but over time we added some more articles. These articles reveal a lot of things about who used the beach and where and when. Many family names are mentioned. Lots of unnamed groups are mentioned. We understand the size of the group. We understand how they got here. We understand how long they stayed. Typically, for a long time period, it was difficult to get to the beach, and once you got there, you didn't go back home the same day. You stayed 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months or the summer. So we now know the names of the people, the uses of the beach enumerated in the newspaper articles, and the cultural patterns that those uses represent. Here are just a few newspaper clippings. The ones on the left are from about Grayton Beach from 1907, 1908, 1914. They list various people who visit the beach. They returned where they had been the past 2 months. They are spending a week or two. They are now at the beach where they expect to remain for 3 weeks, and so on. This series was, in the Defuniak Herald, was named Grayton Beach News, and it appeared on a regular basis during the season when people spent time at the beach. The beach was not used year-round. The pattern was typically that the family, minus the breadwinner, would go to the beach, stay for an extended period of time. The father usually would come down on the weekends and then go back on Monday, go back to work, and this pattern is mentioned over and over again. So for the time period that the news articles were available, we can see how quickly that number of people mentioned in the articles has grown until finally we approach 1,000 people mentioned total by the 1930s. Now, I mentioned to you the aerial photography and how there is a large-scale map of it in the hallway. This photography comes from the Florida Department of Transportation, the University of Florida, and the United States Geological Survey. It's in black and white and color, and the older photography is, the lower its resolution, the harder it is to read and interpret. The more recent, the more you can tell about it. The aerial photography, probably more than any other source, gives indications of the chronology and the patterns of land use and development. We paid special attention to dirt roads and trails that extended to the beach and provided people access, a way to get to the beach, and also beach paths that provided people a way to get from the road through the sand dune vegetation to the beach. In addition, on the aerial photographs, we can see the structures, and we can see the chronology of development and the outlines or the internal roads of subdivisions. This is the aerial photography mosaic. You can see that the airplane which shot these photos traveled in parallel lines north and south, and we downloaded and pieced together all of those overlapping photographs from those parallel lines perpendicular to the coast. 1955 and 1956, there's a little piece missing in the vicinity of Grayton Beach. The one on the block on the left was from 1955, the block on the right was from 1956. 68, 69, we'll see in more detail later, but these are showing additional ways, each decade, new ways to get to the coast, larger number of paths, a larger number of buildings at and near the coastline. The aerial photography of 1974 is the last flight that we have in the 1970s, but we use the maps as a background and show everything that happened in the 1970s, including that after 74 through 79. And we won't look at a lot of aerial photographs in detail, but I just wanted to indicate one to show you the kind of detail that the photo contains and how it can be interpreted. This is in the western part of the county, blocking the name of the lake right now, but it's a location where Highway 98 was relatively close to the beach and where many people parked along the edge of the highway, walked through the dunes on established paths, and accessed the beach in that way. Each blue arrow shows in the aerial photography a parked car at the end of a beach path, and each red triangle shows where a beach path meets the beach. We used Walton County subdivision plats and platted all of the subdivisions that we could find information on from the county clerk's plat books from 1890 to the end of the 1970s. These plat maps show the location, the boundaries, the lots, the roads, and the dedications, many of which for dedications of the beach for public use. They show reservations along the beach and seaward lot lines. So to look at the subdivision plats on a county-wide basis, we can understand the chronology and the pattern of available places to live along the shore and when they were developed. Now, not all land developed in the county was in a recorded subdivision. As you'll see from the aerial photographs and the maps, many buildings and many roads exist outside of subdivisions. So between 1890, when Grayton Beach was recorded as the first subdivision and then reconfirmed in 1893, through 1979, we find approximately 50 subdivisions along the coast in Walton County. All of these subdivisions either front on the beach or have beach access from across the highway. So you can begin to see now the significance of the pattern of the three large tracts of what is now public land and the subdivisions interspersed between those large tracts, which never became available for development. Call your attention to the Sea Highland tract, which was developed by an owner who thought that beach access was important enough to provide an individual pathway between every private lot, and whose plat says that the beach is reserved for the public. The Seagrove Second Edition dedicates the beach for a swimming park. White's Gulfview Estates shows a picture of people lying on a blanket on the beach. Now, we've just reviewed all of the types of information. Let's put all of that information together now with the GIS in some maps. And this is the historical narrative section as opposed to the preceding sources of information section. So for convenience, we've divided this into various historical, I'll call them periods, Native American and colonial period from 3000 BC or 5,000 years ago to 1823, which is when Florida became a territory. We run the second one through 1939, and then use decades, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s after that. These divisions depend a lot on the sources of information available. 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s are all represented by aerial photographs, the others by other kinds of information. The archaeological sites from the Florida Master Site File along the peninsula show a pattern that is very typical of Native American occupation, and that reflects how Native people lived on the land and in close approximation to the water. So every yellow line is a number of an archaeological site that is recorded in the Florida Master Site File. And notice how these are distributed along the beach in relation often to the dune lakes, and then in later time periods they are concentrated on the bay side, but again adjacent to the water. The reason that the water was so important to Native people, several reasons. Number one, it was a source of food and raw materials, but it was also a transportation highway. The main mode of transportation for Native Americans in the Southeast for thousands of years was by dugout canoe. If you lived on or near the beach, it was like living on a transportation corridor. You could get with your canoe anywhere along the coast in a very short time. You could go back into the bay and you could ascend the rivers or descend the rivers. And in that way, you could move people and goods. You would have access to resources that you otherwise couldn't reach. One piece of landscape evidence which is fascinating and important is called Walker's Canal, and it runs from Horseshoe Bayou to Fuller's Lake. It was an artificial connection dug by Native people prior to European contact so that they could paddle in their canoes between Choctawhatchee Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. It was discovered in the 1880s by S.T. Walker, a very early Florida archaeologist, and then it's been studied a couple times after that. And we can see it not only from Walker's point of view in the 1880s as to how it existed then when it was more prominent, but we can also see it on aerial photography where the route of the canal is very visible as indicated by these white lines. And Fuller Lake to Horseshoe Beach is the narrowest part of the peninsula. And if you had access to move back and forth between the two water bodies there, you could save 10 miles in paddling all the way to Destin and coming back to the same location but in the other water body. This is an amazing painting by the American Indian painter George Catlin, who visited Pensacola in 1834, 1835. You would recognize the white dunes behind. This is on Santa Rosa Island, not on Choctawhatchee Peninsula, but it's indicative of how the Indians used the beach from which they fished. The explanation of this image is that they are drying redfish, which Catlin calls their favorite food. In 1766, 3 years after Britain took control of East and West Florida, the surveyor George Galt began mapping or produced maps of the Gulf Coast especially, and here he gave a great deal of detail about the Bay of Santa Rosa, which sometimes the Brits called St. Rose. There are indications of Indian villages. There are geographic landmarks such as the high bluffs and their unique colors, and there are descriptions about the depth of water and how one might traverse the bay and then go up Choctawhatchee River. So all of the sources of information combined through 1939 are represented on this map. This is the first United States Geological Survey quadrangle map of the area. It's a highly detailed and accurate representation of the landscape, including the roads, the buildings, the contours, the wetlands. And on top of that, I have superimposed the public lands in the 3 large parcels, as well as the subdivisions that existed in 1930 up to 1939. Sheet 1 detail of that, beginning in Okaloosa County, shows Miramar Beach, one of the very early beachfront developments on the east side, on the west side of the beachfront. Sheet 2 shows largely the Topsail Hill large tract. But look at the number of roads, both improved roads and also sand roads that parallel and in some cases extend to the beach. Grayton Beach, by 1939, Grayton Beach was a well-developed community. It had good road access from Highway 98, which was completed in 1936. To the west of that, on the right, you can see the north-south road that runs to Seagrove Beach. And then Highway 98 eventually reaches back toward the Gulf or in the vicinity of Inlet Beach. So the first homestead, the first private ownership was by Captain Gray and his family, who settled at Grayton. Two associates of his, he was a military veteran, and he obtained that by a military patent deed. Two of his associates began to develop that community, and it is one of the earliest continuing well-established beach communities in the state. This is a picture of the Armstrong family on the beach. Note the carriage and the horses, and also the bathing attire. Lots of people who visited the beach at Grayton did not own their own property there and didn't have a way of staying in somebody else's property, so they used the Washaway Hotel, which is well known, and you're probably all familiar with that. This building lasted several decades, eventually was destroyed in a hurricane, and then the wood was used to rebuild another lodging place. So just a couple of representative photographs. These are published in local histories from Seagrove Beach, where there was a dance pavilion. It's said in the narrative accounts that scores or as many as 100 people could be there on a Friday or Saturday night. There was live music and very popular place. Now in 1940 through 1949, of course, the significant event was World War II, and Walton County, like so many other counties, was affected in many ways by the war. This was not a time in the middle of the decade when there were a lot of people who had the means to get to the beach or who had recreation on their minds. There were other more important things to be done. Nonetheless, you can see from the purple squares on this map that there were a string of buildings along the beach during this time period, and still a number of additional and continuing subdivisions along the beach through 1949. The orange lines show unimproved road access to the beach. The red lines are major highways, and the blue lines are improved roads. In the detail of 1940 through 49, we can see on the western side of the county how the beach is beginning to be divided into subdivisions, but in addition to that, there are roads that offer access, and they also offer building sites, and they also contain buildings, even though they're not in subdivisions. Large tract, not much settlement there. But look how settlement is beginning to show on the west side. We'll see it in the next map. And people are concentrating their subdivisions and access and building along the dune lakes, but also in other areas. And by 1949, County Road 30A is beginning to be developed. And look at the network of orange or yellow unimproved roads that provide access to the beach from a variety of locations. Grayton Beach again, Seagrove. Four more developments. In the beach, had a period of development in the 1920s and was a resort for a time. It's now beginning to have some private development. This is a view of Grayton Beach in the 40s, just so you can get an idea of its types of buildings and road network and its size. And this is the aerial photograph, Grayton Beach from 1949, and you can see how extensive the sale of lots has been and the construction of houses or buildings. By the 50s, the road network is improving, the density of buildings is increasing, the number of ways to get to the beach is increasing, the number of subdivisions is now getting large. More subdivisions. We can see more concentration along the dune lakes. Blue Mountain is visible here, and Dune Allen has gone through an original subdivision plus 2 additions by the end of the 1950s. Grayton Beach, Seagrove is developed for a couple of miles of coastline now. And now you can see what's happening at Inlet Beach on the eastern side of the county, where there's a grid of neighborhood streets and roads that extend down to the beach and many buildings being developed there. Photograph of what the houses look like in Dune Allen. People definitely using the beach in this photograph, but it gives you an impression of how different the beach front was in terms of its economic basis, in terms of the size of houses and so on compared to today. Seagrove Beach in the 1950s, moving a house on the beach in the 1950s. 1954, particularly, was the first time, I think, that this area had been referred to as the Miracle Strip. And there was an article in the Pensacola Journal that went on excitedly about the opportunities, about the facilities, about the wonderful future that would await the continued development of this part of the coastline. And it's already underway. You can see fringes to beach apartments, the Coastal Grill, Miramar is occupied. These are photos that were submitted by local residents, and it's not hard to recognize, at least for me, the different kinds of swimming attire and how the activities were so different at the beach then, but certainly they were activities of beach use. Again, 1950s at Eastern Lake and Seagrove Beach. This map represents the decade of the 1960s. The subdivisions increase in number. The secondary roads that get to the beach are now quite tightly packed. The highways are well developed. I won't go through all of these, but you can see now how dense the building is and how many roads there are between the highway and the beach. And the spaces between the 3 large parcels are beginning to fill with subdivisions now, as well as unrecorded development. Inlet Beach. So activity is a little different in the 1960s. There was a 4th of July parade annually for some time when and four-wheel drive vehicles rode on the beach. Driving on the beach was very common. There are accounts of driving from one county line to the other line, of driving to Bishop's store to get some gas. Fishermen used four-wheel drive vehicles. People drove the beach as an alternative road. Just a wide range of activities in these photographs. And this map now represents the end of the period of our study. And the reason it stops in 1979 is because it seemed to me that by this time, customary use had been very well established in Walton County, all along the coastline. And at this point also, the fundamental way of using the beach changes. Up until this time, the beach was accessed in a variety of locations. Lots of people had ways of getting to the beach. They had lots of ways of moving up and down the beach. And after this time, it began to be true that beach use depended on finding a way to get to the beach where you were not restricted, and also finding a place where you could park along the highway where it was safe to do so. So by this time of the 1970s decade, much of the beach had been limited in access by private ownership, and use of the beach was funneled in particular to places where there either had been traditional access or where local government had provided access. We begin to see in the 1970s the first large-scale developments, golf course developments that extend far inland from the beach. And it's beginning to be the case that developed or undeveloped, there's just a continuous line of places to get to the beach and buildings along the beach. Sailing and catamarans was very popular for a time in the 1970s. There's the regatta. Now, from all of the sources that I looked at, I compiled a list of all of the activities that were documented use of the dry sand. And I won't read all of these to you. You have a copy of them. But I just will point out a few. The list is somewhat chronological. The first half page or so through catching and drying redfish are activities that would have been common during the Native American period. After that, we see people riding horses, mules, and wagons on the dry sand. Certainly that was very early in Walton County's beach history. But what's important to me about this list is that it demonstrates the huge variety of ways that people use the beach. It's not just sandcastles. It's not just beach umbrellas. It's not just beach chairs. The beach was a part of everyday life during the beach season, and over time, people use the beach in so many different ways, all of which fit into their cultural pattern of how they lived in Walton County, how they raised their family, how they passed on their family traditions, how they organized their social networks. So, you can review that list and satisfy yourself as to the range of activities that constitute beach use in Walton. I just wanted to close by, again, emphasizing the 4 elements of customary use and indicating how our information can speak to those. As to whether the use is ancient, it began about 5,000 years ago. 3,500 years of that occupation was by Native Americans alone. Native American use continues to the present. The first private ownership was in the 1890s, more than a century ago. The first subdivision was in the 1890s, and by 1950 there were already 14 subdivisions along the coast in Walton County. Is the use without interruption? I take that to mean not whether it was discontinuous, but rather was an action taken that would interrupt someone's use of the beach. The land was owned until the patent deeds were issued, as I mentioned, so prior to that time, in that sense, there could not be an interruption. The first private ownership began in the 90s, and during the entire period of our research, I found no interruption in the right of use, and I found no interruption in the exercise of use. Except for the last 10 years or so, all interviewed longtime residents and visitors stated there was never any objection or restriction to beach use. Is the use free of dispute? Again, there was no private owner to dispute use of the beach until a patent deed had been issued. By 1931, 98.5% of the beachfront land had been conveyed to private owners. From the 1890s to the end of the study period, the historical research revealed no incident or pattern or concept that an owner of beachfront land could restrict use of the dry sand. Except for the last 10 years, all interviewed longtime residents and visitors stated there was never any dispute in their experience about the use of dry sand. And finally, is the use reasonable? Based on the historical research and the interviews, it seemed to me that use of the beach is a normal and expected human activity that is within the realm of the ordinary. There's nothing unusual about the kinds of beach use activities that we've documented. It's appropriate to the character of the land. There are not competing uses for the beach. This is a traditional use of the beach, which the beach is best suited for. And it's appropriate to the traditions of the community. People have been using the beach for such a long time. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Don. Okay, Sid, I think you have some witnesses.
Yes, sir. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Just real briefly before we get to a few witnesses that I would like to call up, I want to thank everybody who submitted photographs and affidavits this summer. It was a very busy and stressful summer, as I'm sure a lot of you can imagine, but looking at those pictures every day and talking to people about how they've used the beach made it well worth it. So I want to thank everybody who participated in that. I also wanted to thank the group Florida Beaches for All for their work and volunteering to collect affidavits. I I specifically wanted to thank Jackie Markell and Dana Harmon, and I'm going to forget others who also volunteered their time, but they had set out a goal of collecting 10,000 affidavits, and we are very close to that goal if we haven't already exceeded. So thank you for that hard work.
On the affidavits, I just wanted to clarify, I had not looked at the final number. We actually did exceed 10,000. Through Wednesday, 12,958. So thank you.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to just a handful of witnesses. These are people who, many of them have been helping us for several years. You know, unfortunately, there are a few people that I wish were here today that can't be here. One of those is Judge McGee. I'm very sad that he's not here today, but his wife, Karen McGee, is going to speak on his behalf. But what I'm going to do is just call up a few of these people who, like I said, have helped us from the beginning and can put a little bit of a human face to all the things that Dr. Miller spoke to us about. So first, I'd like to call up Ann Tucker, who's here to represent the Muskogee Nation. And everybody, whenever you come forward, please be very careful of the steps.
You have to get the microphone. Jason's not here.
Can you hear me? Chairman Chapman, members of the Walton County Board of Commissioners, citizens of Walton County. My name is Ann Denson Tucker. I'm the chairwoman of the Tribal Council of Muskogee Nation of Florida, the Florida tribe of Eastern Creek Indians. With me is Chris Thompson, a young man mentoring now in our art of shell carving, and Bobby DeBose, a traditional elder of our tribe. On August 25th of this year, a meeting was called by the Speaker of our Council to discuss the question of customary use of the Walton County beaches. Southeastern tribal people understand how a single act passed through legislation or determined in a court of law can affect every aspect of a life, of a people, or of a universe. In our history, law was used to eliminate established boundaries, to abolish treaties, to racially exterminate us, to prevent land access and ownership by Indian people. We understand these strategies. We are your living history. We are people who have been here from the beginning time. We are people who lived as a community, worked this land, and traveled by waterways. This is our homeland, and our tie to this county is an unbroken tie. The mound builders were our ancestors. They encountered the Spanish in 1500. Today, our tribal government continues to preserve and protect 4,000-year-old mounds in South Walton County. They will never be disrespected by this tribe by paving over them, putting condos on top of them, pretended they never existed, or deciding with minimal outside testing that they are just not important enough to save. Our oldest graves in the tribal cemeteries of Bruce were covered with shells from these shores. The overdevelopment of the coastline in the last 50 years and the influx of people have depleted this food source and have impacted traditions associated with our oldest burial practices. Before us, generations came to these shores each year to gather shells for our graves. Shells ensured our people's graves were properly identified, that they were traditionally remembered. We followed the same tradition and placed shells onto new graves as recently as last month. Only now the tribe has to import them. Coastal shells were used and are still used in our carved jewelry and gorgets, a traditional art form that identifies our people, our clan system, our tribal iconography, and our oldest stories. My grandmother came to these shores like her mother and grandmother before her, to collect salt from the Gulf. This was the place we bathed family members who were ill. The Gulf was our healing waters. When ashihaki is harvested to make medicine, it's understood that the strongest medicine or the plants in the salt spray zone along the coastline. This ceremonial practice was first documented by the Spanish. This medicine is still used in 4 ceremonies a year. It's prepared by the tribes Hilishaya, whose bloodline contains the knowledge and the traditions of generations of makers of medicine over hundreds of years. Our families bring a bucket of white sand to place on the grounds each year. The sand comes from these shores. Our ceremonial grounds are surrounded by an unbroken circle of shells. The shells delineate a space that is considered sacred and separate from the outside world, like the walls of a church. Our relationship with this beach and these waters was seasonal. It's the way it should be. We floundered and crabbed on the full moon with hand-knotted nets and corn sacks tied around our waist to put them in. By the 1920s and 30s, our community actually had one car. We had a Model A that could be driven down a dirt road to Jolly Bay to catch a ferry to these beaches. We found the tunnels that were cut through the deep brush that allowed us access to the water. The tunnels were what we used to identify where we were, because there were so few houses and there were no people. The Billy Bowlegs Festival has been celebrated since 1953. It's loosely based on William Augustus Bowles, a white man who arrived from Maryland in 1795. He married a Creek woman and he tried to create a separate nation of Muskogean people. Our ancestors were among those people along the Northwest Florida shoreline when he arrived. We are listed on Spanish land grants of a territory called West Florida, on the same river as the other Yuchi descendants of Sam Story, the man we called Tempuchi Canard, before Florida became a state. We moved back and forth across the 31st parallel as President Andrew Jackson invaded Florida and legislated Indian removal. We raised cattle, we farmed, and we always tried to come back home. Our ancestry was one of the last documented speakers of the Mobilian trade language that was used across the historic Confederacy in 1800. The Creek Confederacy had 187 towns. It had 28 dialects. It used one language among them all. When the United States annexed Florida from the Spanish and British Alliance, we had to reestablish our homesteads. Bruce was considered safe haven for Indian people who by state laws passed in 1853 were not allowed to live openly as Indian people under penalty of death. This law stayed on the books until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. We timbered and logged the Choctawhatchee River. We accessed the beach for seasonal food and harvested plants for ceremonies and medicines without restriction. My mother was born in 1924. She is 94 years old and has lived here all her life. She's the first educated member of our community. As a child, she would visit her grandmother's house near Seagrove. There was a wall across the back of the porch. It wasn't a wall of rocks to stop erosion. We know that erosion and hurricanes and storm surge is why we did not build permanent structures on the south side of the old beach roads. Inside her grandmother's walls was where a giant sea turtle lived. It was large enough for 2 children to ride. This was the time when the turtles were allowed to thrive. They did not require human intervention just to be able to survive in their natural habitat. In those times, there were no private property keep-out signs that threatened us with prosecution. There were no fences. No one denied us access. We lived here with respect for a place that existed in a fragile balance between coastal dune lakes, the Choctawhatchee Bay, the river and its sloughs, and the Gulf of Mexico. And we were taught the first lesson: take only what you need for your community, not everything you want. It's the way people should treat this place, and it's the way people should treat each other in this divisive time. This is who we were, and it is who we still are. We live on our original homesteads. even though we're no longer allowed to walk on the trails that were our history because they have chains across them. These roads were used for hunting, fishing, turpentining, conducting our ceremonies. They were used to bury our dead. To us, controlled access means nothing more than the subjugation of a traditional way of life of Indian people by people who prefer that we just move someplace else because we're in the way. We see no difference with those who wish to eliminate customary use and the controlled access we now find ourselves living under. We have never lived more than 90 miles in any direction from Bruce, Florida. We are not people who moved here from someplace else to retire because we happened to visit or read about it. We were told many years ago the county's policy would create a vacation resort for families to visit with their children, not a privatized retirement community for wealthy people. We do not support the continued development of investment properties motivated by profit and greed when the infrastructure and the transportation system fails at supporting what's already here. Who explains to a family who spends thousands of dollars to rent a house for a week that their children cannot build a sandcastle because they're not allowed to walk on the beach? How does it happen that a few people go to an outside court system into Tallahassee to ensure that thousands of people are denied customary use, but only in one county? Aren't these the same people who built their empires on the backs of these tourists in the first place? After Hurricane Michael, there was one road to Panama City. It was and is the road that cuts through our tribal community where we have lived in safety for hundreds of years. Hurricane Michael's a lesson, and it's a wake-up call if you choose to listen. We do not accept that beach access is about property law, just forgive me. Property law is a vehicle being used to sell it. When we cut to the core of this issue, it's about wealthy transplants and land developers who use political ties and connections to purchase a version of justice. Privatization actions created false circumstances to enable taking something they were not supposed to be allowed to buy in a place where no one should build. The teachings of Iganahaki, the ceremonial grounds of this tribe, have been passed down for generations. I was also raised in the sermons of a Native American church, and I can assure you from both teachings, there's not one star in the sky, nor one wave on that gulf, nor one grain of sand on this beach that was put there by Creator because of your political affiliations, your personal connections to power, nor the balance of your bank account. It was given to all people, and it belongs to all people.
Miss Ann, bring it in, please. Go ahead and finish up. Hurry.
I'm really trying. I'm on page 2. I've got 2 pages left. Very short.
I'll give you another minute. Go ahead.
We were here before you knew this place existed. We will be here when you leave, or when Creator's storm finally washes away the sand. In the meantime, no small entourage should be free to make new and improved bad decisions that circumvents the will and the desire of the people of this county. No one group should be allowed to alienate longtime residents from the beach because their businesses or their houses now wants privacy from the mess that's been created here. No one group has the authority to tell the first Americans that our feet cannot walk on the sand that's been part of our lives, our ceremonies, and our traditions since the beginning time. We do not hear you. Muskogee Nation of Florida stands on the side of the Board of County Commission in a struggle to allow public access by visitors and citizens of this county. We hope you do not lose it, and we hope you fight it for the right reasons. Our historical evidence is documented by the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and our evidence is yours for legal use in any court case that you're required to respond to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to call up a few more witnesses, and then we'll take a brief break or move on to public comment. So next I'd like to call up Miss Brenda Reese. If she would just briefly come up and tell us a little bit about her family and their history in Walton County.
Yep, that's good.
Thank you, Commissioners. Brenda Anderson-Reese, and I want to thank the staff, and I'm so pleased to be able to be here to talk about supporting customary use in Walton County. I'm a native of Walton County, born here in 1953. Some of my family has been here since the early territorial days, especially up in Aliquot, early land grants. My great-uncle, T.T. Wentworth Jr., is the founder of the T.T. Wentworth Jr. Florida State Museum in Pensacola, which has over 150,000 artifacts, which he donated to the state of Florida to document our great history here in Florida and West Florida and Walton County. I'm going to digress and talk about moon dreaming real quick. Dr. Robert Bob Swinford wrote a story about a trip he made to Walton County in 1938 to see his future bride, Mickey Wesley, the ninth and youngest child of William and Katie Wesley, who built the house in Eden in 1897. He was traveling from the University of Florida with his soon-to-be brother-in-law, Billy Wesley, and both of them, by the way, later had land grants there on the beach. So he was traveling down, and he talked about coming down in 1938 and seeing Mickey at her house, which was built in 1938 on Eastern Lake. That house is still there, by the way. They traveled down from the house at Point Washington, down a sand road, across a bridge which is still on, the poles of it are still on the north end of the lake. And they crossed across that sand bridge and came down, and he met Mickey, and they went down to the beach and saw the beautiful moonlight. And he remembers telling me, he was 95 when he told me this story. He came to my house. Mickey had passed away, and Bob was a young 95. He had just remarried a young 76-year-old woman, so he was still driving and doing mighty fine, thank you. But we sat on my back porch and looked across to Mickey's homestead, 1938 Lake house, and he told me about his trip here in 1938. He told me how he and his brother-in-law, Billy Wesley, had land grants, but they didn't keep them because at the time he was a professor at University of Florida. He ended up being a retired emeritus professor of forestry, so I knew a lot about the land, appreciated the beach. So I just kind of wanted to give that. There's a long personal story. And Mickey Wesley's father had a 1903 land grant at Eastern Lake. The 1939 plat still had it as Point Washington. I kind of call it Point Washington Beach. But Bob recalled to me a story Mickey told him about holding her parents' hand and walking down that sand road down to the beach. And they always let the people use the property. Peggy Baylor wrote a book in her Sandpiper Cove about how the people from Point Washington came to the beach and used the beach before they started going to Grayton Beach. And quite frankly, Confederate States of America Brigadier General William Miller owned Grayton Beach before and after, so there's a great Point Washington connection to the beach, an old history. But now I'm gonna go back to, I have a minute and 26 to talk about 1,000,000 years of Florida history. I have always used the beach. My family has, my mother's in her 80s, remembers using the beach. My stepfather, Sonny Hollingsworth, his great uncle was L.I. Smith, who owned the Gulfview Hotel in Camp Walton before he sold it to the Staffs and Gerlachs. But his mother, Anna Smith Hollingsworth Reardon, was a reporter for the Defuniak Herald. Her papers are in the University of West Florida archives, so she has documented all of their years of beach property. Between 1851 and 1913, Camp Walton area was actually in Walton County, but since the beginning of time that we were 1819, next year's the 200th year of the Adams-Onis Treaty when the United States got Florida, and we were part of that we have always had beachfront property. Walton County has. 1821, when George Walton, who we're named for, came, we had beach property. And so I am for customary use. I've always used it. I mainly just sat on the sand, fished, walked. My grandmother loved to crab. It was, what is public land in perpetuity, and I think we really need to remember that. And time is up, and there's just so much more. Talk to me about Florida history sometime, and let's all appreciate our customary use. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have sand from the 1970s because I lived in Alaska. I went to school in Texas, and I actually kept this in a brandy snifter, and this is actual sand, dry sand from 1970.
Next, I would call Heidi and Grace Mars. And while they walk up, I'm sure Grace will tell us, one of the gentlemen that I got to meet while researching customary use was her husband, Hugh. He was a wonderful man, and unfortunately he passed away last year, but Grace can tell wonderful stories about how they would use the beach together.
Thank you so very much. Can you hear me? Is that good? I am Grace Mars, and with my late husband, Hugh Mars, we have been witness to over 70 years of uninterrupted beach use. And I want to thank Dr. Miller for his presentation and the mapping of our beaches recently by the TDC. Is a very, very good start and an endorsement of customary use. I think it shows concerns for the importance of each of these beach lots. Being compatible is so important for this Gulfront property. Being compatible with the concept of customary use and also the neighborhood. Common sense usage is there for all of us, and should be for all of us. I often question lately, after we had these interruptions or the grievances against customary use, why anyone would purchase a lot on the Gulf front of the world's most beautiful beaches and then assume that they would be the only people that would ever use it. These magnificent beaches are ours. We're all stewards of this, and I didn't realize how much Indian blood I had in me. Thank you, Ann Tucker. And also, Dr. Miller, a footnote, my husband was probably one of the recent people to swim the bay to gain access to the beaches. We both grew up here, and we honor it, and we love it. And again, we are all stewards of this land, and please let it be so. Thank you, Commissioners.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Heidi Mars Ellis. I'm very fortunate to be a second generation to live in the Sea Highland subdivision in Seagrove Beach. My husband, Jeffrey Ellis, was one of the first employees of the TDC here in Walton County back in the 1980s. He helped establish Sports Fest to be able to use the beaches for swimming, biking, and running. We have, along the beaches, have been using the beaches of South Walton County from Rosemary Beach, Seacrest, Seagrove, Seaside, Blue Mountain Beach, Dune Allen, and Miramar Beach openly and notoriously since the 1970s for recreation purposes without any interruption. We have considered some of our best dates to be sitting down on the beach, watching the sunset, and enjoying the experience. We were always taught never to leave to leave no trace behind, to preserve and to protect the beaches, and to share them with everyone, because we were so fortunate that this was our home, and not everyone was able to have access to a beach as beautiful as this. We frequently host triathletes who will come to our home at 6 o'clock in the morning to be able to do an open water swim. Afterward, we will always have a fellowship down on the beach where people can finish watching the sunrise. They can be able to run, they can rest, they can relax, and they can enjoy the beach for the purposes that it's meant to be. Thank you so much. We really want to be able to continue to have customary use and support our beaches.
Thank you, ma'am.
And then finally, I would call up Ms. Karen McGee.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Karen McGee, and I live at 383 Lakeview Drive in the Eastern Lake subdivision. My husband, Tom McGee, you might remember him. He carried the titles of offices he'd been elected to, judge and fire commissioner. But he might have been called haranguer-in-chief about customary use, as he talked about it for 10 years, long before it became such a well-known issue. Since he passed away a few days before the September meeting, I'm trying to speak for him today. Tom was a practicing lawyer for 40 years, 24 of those as a judge. He'd read and he'd studied about the doctrine of customary use, and he absolutely believed in it. He was also a fireman's son, and as a judge, he was dependent upon the police to keep him safe from the threats faced by black robe types who anger both criminals and non-support fathers. So I believe that he would have said that involving the sheriff's office and the fire department as pawns in this controversy, wanting law enforcement to be in the middle of it, and complaining that rescue ATVs should drive only on the wet sand and not cross the dry sand to change flags because they leave marks in the sand. I believe that Tom McGee would have said, that is just silly. I believe that he would have told you today that concerns about the beach chair vendors are not about customary use. That's something the BCC needs to guts up and deal with it, but it is not. But it is not about the public's right to traverse the dry sand. That's another issue. Just as loud parties or people who come into your property to ask to use the restroom are not about customary use. That's about enforcement of county ordinances. Someone needs to figure out how to enforce our ordinances preventing trespass or mobs at drunken parties. But those are issues for the black robe types and people who have badges and big guns, and are not about the public's ancient and customary right to traverse the dry sand beach. Many of you knew my husband and know that he'd been a lawyer and a judge, fire district commissioner, chair of the planning commission, on the beach activities committee, founder of the Camel Club, and lots of other activities. What you didn't know is that before we moved to South Walton 21 years ago, we both almost drowned off the Miramar Beach in Walton County when we were caught in a rip current and pulled off our feet and suddenly found ourselves swimming for our lives. That was back in the day when we didn't have the lifeguards and the flag system wasn't so well known, and Tom, who'd scuba dived all over the Caribbean, was terrified that he'd lose his life. I don't think we want to return to a day when the national headlines read, National Judge of the Year and his wife drowned in Walton County. Their rescue was hindered by rules about rescue ATVs traversing the dry sand. Luckily, we survived that scary day, and later moved to South Walton in 1997, where we regularly walked and sat on the beach, played with our dogs, from Deer Lake to Seagrove Beach, without interruption and without interference, on a regular basis. I have memories of cooking hot dogs on a $3 grill and, well, just heating them up, actually, and watching the stars with my husband, his brother, and his wife. And I have the most memorable, probably, that Tom would tell you about, of running down the beach with a 7-year-old grandson whom his grandfather had convinced there were cougars and bobcats hiding in the dunes while he was teaching them what a snipe hunt is all about. There are many other memories about walking and playing and being on the beach, fishing and crabbing and all kinds of things. And Tom McGee would have told you that is what customary use is about. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, before we break, I want to make an announcement. This meeting will be on YouTube, and it'll be available as soon as this meeting is over with. It will also be available through our website on Granicus on Monday. So if anybody needs a copy of it or wish to watch it again. The next thing up on the agenda is we're going to take a break, allow the board to get a little nourishment or whatever. Y'all are welcome to do so. Just remember, if you leave the confines of what's been set up, you'll have to go through rescreening with the sheriff's office. And then we'll go into the public comment. With everybody here now, could I get just a show of hands if you're planning on making a public comment? Okay. All right, you can put your hands down. I appreciate that. That'll give us a little idea as the time allotted for each speaker when we come back. So with nothing else, we're going to be standing recess until 11:30. Thank you.